Hello, I'm Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska, and my guest is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And we've recorded a couple of conversations about what some Alexander teachers' famous quotes, what they mean or what the implications of them are. And this is, I think, the third in our series. We did one with a Margaret Goldie quote, one with an Alexander quote. This is from Marjorie Barstow. And just to put it in context, one thing about Marjorie was she was the master of knowing what and how to say things in the moment when things would come up. I think part of that ability was just in part of her, but I think also her early entry, you might say, into group teaching kind of forced her to really be extremely careful about what she would say to an individual, given that there was a whole group of people observing this interaction at the same time. So she was kind of a genius at that. And I don't know whether you're familiar with neuro-linguistic programming, NLP.
I've heard of it.
a kind of, you might say, the study of how you use language to effectively to bring about the changes you want. She could have, and a lot of it's based on early parts of it were based on a particular guy, a psychologist, I think, in Arizona, who was, no one could quite understand what he was doing during his sessions, but his patients got better in a way that, in surprising ways. And they went and they had videos of him, and they would follow that very carefully and look at little details of what was going on. And then they came up with some theories about how to do that yourself. And Marge could have been equally good example to watch, because she produced these little gems on a regular basis. Now, this little gem was different from others. This is something that she would often say on the last day or next to last day of a long workshop. Her summer workshops were 4 weeks long, and there were a lot of people that were there for all 4 weeks. And sometime towards the end, she would say something like this. I don't have an exact quote, but she would say, when you go home and people ask you, what did you learn in Nebraska? Don't tell them a little bit of nothing. Now, you got to understand there are a lot of kind of unspoken thoughts here. First of all, Nebraska is not exactly known as a hotbed of new ideas about how to use yourself. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere in America, and she was the teacher. It was the only teacher in Nebraska at that time. And in fact, I actually am the only teacher now in Nebraska.
Oh, really?
John's
wow.
retired. Yeah, John.
That's right.
Retired. Yeah. So there, it's kind of weird. But so there was that aspect of it. Why would anyone go to Nebraska for anything? Background. But I think she did this often enough. And I think she had an agenda. And
so just one thing that strikes me immediately, she was telling her students what not to do, but she wasn't telling them what to say.
Well, yes.
That's my first sort of thought about it.
Right. She wasn't telling them what to say.
Just
maybe,
what not.
or maybe
Oh, okay.
here's the NLP sort of take on it. She's saying it's what NLP people call polarity response. You say to someone to do something or not to do something specifically in order to get them to do it. It's like a reaction to a statement. Don't do this. It can often lead to someone's, oh, okay, I'm going to do this.
You kind of reverse psychology.
Well, it's like in the moment how someone responds to a statement like that. So saying to this group, don't tell people this, for sure, it embeds it in their minds. Like suddenly there's this idea that they perhaps had never occurred to them to say to anybody. And suddenly he's saying, well, don't tell them this. It's quite possible that some people would say, okay, that's what I'm going to tell them and see what happens. That's one possible explanation. Another, this one comes from John Macy, actually, a colleague here in Omaha. He said maybe they learned quite a bit about a little bit of about nothing, which to mean inhibition. And so why you don't want to say a little bit, maybe if you're going to say anything, say, I learned quite a bit. I mean, that's
I learned a lot about a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So there's that. So yeah, the saying don't, that's kind of a polarity thing. Let's see. Another way of looking at it is, at the very least, if you get home and people ask you what you learned, and you have no idea what to say, you might just revert to this. I learned a little bit of nothing. And that could lead to an interesting discussion about what that means.
Yeah, true. That. I'm also thinking she was planting a seed that you may be asked, and what are you going to say, so that people might think about what they did learn ahead of time, because she's kind of prompting that inquiry.
There's that. Also, you could say, so telling someone don't say something is a kind of a inhibitory request of a sort, right? Don't do it. And it's about inhibition. And so there's like these two tracks there, don't say you learned about don't say you learned about don't doing things.
Not doing.
So there's that kind of overlay, you might say, or a parallel path. I think she wanted to say something. It could be taken in a lot of different ways, all of which would have been just fine with her. Any one of them. Like, oh, come up with something to say, for sure. You don't want to say that. And also to get people thinking. I mean, I'm sure there were some people for whom the idea of they were learning a little bit of nothing was a brand new idea. Now, she did use the phrase occasionally.
I've heard that phrase.
Wasn't totally new, but she wasn't out there all the time talking about that. There would just be occasionally, she said, well, it's just a little bit of nothing. Someone would say, I feel so different. What happened? And she would say, just a little bit of nothing. But that wasn't real. It wasn't like she didn't pound away at that. That was just an occasional phrase. But to bring it to the fore at the end, I thought thinking in retrospect, was kind of genius. I mean, when I heard that phrase, I had no idea what to do with it,
that was going to be my question. You, as one of her students or participants at the workshop, when she said that,
I
What
was
did you go home and say?
I didn't say that. I honestly, I just put it aside at the time as being a slightly bizarre thing. But over the years, especially lately, I've been starting with all the work with that Margaret Goldie's work has kind of come more to the fore about her views on inhibition. It got me to thinking that Marge really had something quite interesting in mind. It had sort of bypassed me at the time, but now cycling back to it, I'm thinking that was actually a pretty profound thing to say, even if it just caused someone to think, what on earth is she talking about?
Well, yeah. I think if it prompts that, or it prompts you to think, well, what have we been doing? It starts you trying to verbalize it.
Right. Right. So that's pretty much what I have, my thoughts on it. I will say that I said earlier that she was kind of a natural genius at the use of language. And another example that perhaps more Alexander teachers would be familiar with is Walter Carrington, who in his own way, in a very different way from Marge, he too was a master of language, of storytelling. I mean,
yeah, I've heard that too.
You'd have a private lesson with him, and about 2 minutes in, he'd start off on some topic that seemed to have no relationship at all to anything you knew about, and it would end precisely at the end of the lesson. And afterwards, you'd think back, and he had said some pretty profound things. He was sort of sneaking them in to
kind of weave them into the story rather than
and that he was a genius at that, honestly. Marge did not work primarily when I knew her with didn't do individual lessons. She was pretty much always out there in a group situation, and sometimes like 80 or 90 people in the room.
So that requires a very different use.
And when a particularly poignant question would come up, she would take quite a long time to, 5 seconds maybe.
Yeah, but she didn't just immediately, as I did then, just come out with
because
her
there's like 80 people in the room, and anything I say, I need to take into account where all these people are. Some of them had just arrived, and others had been working in
teaching for
decades. So what do I say? So she would take the time for the right answer to pop up. I guess you could say she was inhibiting. Another way of saying it.
For sure, yeah.
So that's all I have to say about it.
Interesting.
Anything else any other thoughts cross your mind on this?
I don't think so, except it just is a curiosity, and thought-provoking, which I think is probably what she was, one of the things she was going for, is that it would provoke thought in the people.
She was totally about getting people to think for themselves. That was her primary motivation, I would say. Okay, so my guest has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington. I'll put a link to her website, and I'll put a link to some basic information about the technique, and a link to Marjorie Barstow's website that has tons of information about her and her teaching. So thank you, Imogen.
Thank you, Robert.